when the HOA president suddenly pulled a gun from his waistband, his hand trembling and his face flushed bright red. I thought to myself, this idiot has no idea what he's just done. My wife, Sarah, just smirked slightly. 10 years in Delta Force, 7 deployments to some of the deadliest places on Earth, and now she was standing face to face with a power-hungry wannabe cop threatening to shoot her, all over a red front door. Curious where you're hearing this story? Drop a comment below, because you won't believe what happened next. That was the moment I realized our only choice was to let Sarah do what she does best, neutralize threats. And as it turned out, this was only the beginning of a war with the police that we never asked for. We'd moved to Paradise Pines just 3 months ago, after I landed a software engineering job in Tampa. The neighborhood looked perfect, quiet streets, a community pool, and just 25 minutes from MacDill Air Force Base, where Sarah was stationed. The realtor warned us there was an active HOA, but we weren't worried. We'd dealt with homeowners associations before, just some basic rules about lawn care and decorations. Our new house had everything we wanted and seemed perfect until we met Richard Wellington. The day after moving in, I was unloading boxes when a shadow fell across the driveway. I turned to see a tall, wiry man in his 60s, dressed in pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the Paradise Pines HOA logo embroidered on the chest. What caught my eye immediately was the unmistakable bulge of a holstered handgun at his waist. "Michael Johnson," he said with the tone of a man used to being obeyed. "I'm Richard Wellington, president of the Paradise Pines HOA. Here's your copy of our covenant and conditions." He thrust a thick 3-ring binder toward me, at least 2 inches thick. "Read it thoroughly. We take our rules very seriously here." When Sarah emerged from the house, Richard's demeanor shifted. "Mrs. Johnson, I presume," he said. "I'm Richard Wellington, former law enforcement. I'm Paradise Pines' very own police force." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Sarah smiled politely, though I caught the calculating look in her eyes, sizing him up. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Wellington," she said. "It's Officer Wellington to most folks around here," he corrected, patting his gun. 28 years on the force before retirement. That evening, Sarah mentioned something seemed off about him. His stance doesn't match a serious cop. The way he carries that gun? Poor positioning. I bet he was a meter maid who never drew his weapon outside of training. Little did we know just how accurate her assessment was, or how quickly Richard would escalate from annoying HOA president to a genuine threat. The next 2 weeks flew by as we settled in, painting walls, arranging furniture, making the house our own. Our last big project was the front door. The old one was faded and brown, and Sarah had her heart set on a bright red replacement. "It'll really pop against the tan exterior," she said as we browsed paint samples at the hardware store. I knew better than to argue with my wife about home decor. When you're married to someone who can disassemble and reassemble an M4 rifle blindfolded in under a minute, you learn to pick your battles. So that Saturday, we spent the day sanding, priming, and painting the front door a vibrant crimson red. It looked fantastic, a bold statement against the neutral tones of the house. We had no idea this simple color choice would trigger the HOA equivalent of a world war. We didn't realize that bright red door would not only make our house stand out but also awaken the control freak inside Richard. And when the doorbell rang at 6 a.m. the very next morning, that's when hell began to open its doors. The insistent ringing jolted me awake. Stumbling down the stairs in my pajamas, I mentally cursed whoever thought this was an appropriate time for a house call. I flung open the door to find Richard Wellington standing on our porch, ramrod straight, in what looked like a homemade uniform. He wore tan tactical pants, a shirt with epaulettes and the Paradise Pines HOA logo, and an actual badge pinned to his chest that read HOA. The gun at his hip was now in full view, displayed in an open carry holster. Behind him stood a thin woman in her 40s clutching a notepad, her eyes darting nervously between Richard and me. "Mr. Johnson," Richard announced, handing me an official-looking violation notice. "Your household is in direct violation of Paradise Pines Covenant, Section 8, Paragraph 12. All external paint colors must conform to the approved earth tone palette." This abomination, he gestured to our bright red door, must be returned to an approved color within 24 hours, or you will face a $500 fine, with additional penalties accruing daily. I was still processing this ridiculous demand when I heard. Sarah came down the stairs just as Richard was issuing his threat. She had returned from a night training exercise only a couple of hours earlier and had barely slept. Still wearing her multicam uniform pants and a tan t-shirt, her hair pulled back tightly in a bun, she looked every bit the disciplined soldier she was. Richard's eyes briefly widened at the sight of her, but he quickly snapped back to his stiff, authoritative posture. "Ma'am, I don't know what kind of neighborhood you came from," he said with a sneer, "but here in Paradise Pines, we maintain certain standards. Military cosplay doesn't exempt you from the rules." If he thought that would intimidate Sarah, he couldn't have been more wrong. Her face remained calm, but I saw that dangerous stillness settle over her, the same focused, clinical calm I'd witnessed countless times before. Like when she faced down aggressive drunks at bars, or that night in Chicago when a mugger tried to rob us. She was fully alert now, analyzing the situation like the elite soldier she was. "Mr. Wellington," she said coolly, "I'll need to see the exact regulation about approved door colors." Richard smirked and tapped the thick binder I had left on the entryway table. "It's all in there, Section 8, Paragraph 12. Maybe if you'd read it before painting the door, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Without hesitation, Sarah flipped open the binder and quickly found the relevant section. Her eyes scanned the text, then she looked up with a faint smile. "Actually," she said, "this section states that external paint must maintain harmony with the natural environment and not cause undue visual disruption. It doesn't specifically ban red. It's more of a guideline about neighborhood aesthetics." Richard's face flushed darker as Sarah continued. "The approved color palette is on page 94, but it's listed as recommended colors, not required ones. The introduction clearly states these are guidelines unless specifically noted as requirements. The word must doesn't appear anywhere on that page." The woman standing behind Richard, identified as Karen Peterson, the HOA secretary, frantically flipped through her own copy and whispered, "Mr. Wellington, she's technically right about the wording." Richard shot her a glare, silencing her immediately, then turned back to us. His voice dropped into a low growl as he stepped forward, resting his hand deliberately on his holstered gun. "I don't care what technicalities you found. In Paradise Pines, I'm the law. That door gets repainted by tomorrow, or there will be consequences." Later, I asked Sarah, "Are you really going to fight over a door? We could just repaint it and be done." She looked at me with fierce determination. "Mike, that man just put his hand on a weapon and threatened us over paint. This isn't just nitpicking, it's someone dangerous with a god complex. If we give in now, he'll walk all over us." That afternoon, our neighbor James Wilson stopped by. "I saw Wellington here this morning," he said grimly. "That red door thing? It's about control, not color. He does this to every new resident to establish dominance." James went on to explain how he'd been at odds with Wellington over a garden shed that was allegedly 6 inches too tall. "He made my life hell for months, surprise inspections, bogus violations. I even had to get a lawyer." Before leaving, James showed us video he'd recorded of Richard, his hand resting on his gun during their confrontation, just in case things escalated. When Richard returned the next day, once again resting his hand on his weapon while demanding we repaint, I saw a shift in Sarah. It wasn't fear. It was cold, precise calculation. Those who know special operations would recognize that look. Sarah was assessing a threat. Richard had just landed himself on a Delta Force operator's radar, and Sarah was ready to teach this HOA police a lesson. After that second visit, Sarah switched into what I privately called her operational mode. This was the side of her that emerged when planning missions or solving complex tactical problems. She began digging into Richard Wellington's background, using resources most civilians don't have access to. Calling in favors from military intelligence contacts, she spent hours on her laptop, making notes in her black mission notebook. 3 days later, over dinner, she shared what she'd uncovered. Richard Wellington, age 65, was never a real police officer, At least not the way he makes it sound, she explained between bites of pasta. He worked part-time as a traffic enforcement officer in a small Georgia town for about 8 years. Basically, he was a parking ticket writer. Then he moved to Florida and got a job as a security guard at a shopping mall, where he was eventually fired for excessive force against a teenage shoplifter. Sarah continued her briefing, a habit from her military career. He moved to Paradise Pines about 15 years ago and immediately got involved with the HOA. Within 2 years, he'd maneuvered his way into the presidency through some questionable voting procedures. Half the residents mysteriously never received ballots. He's been president ever since, running unopposed for the last 5 election cycles. Sarah flipped a page in her notebook. Here's the interesting part. He's modified the HOA covenant at least 14 times over the past decade, each time giving the president more enforcement power. The latest amendment allows him to inspect properties without prior notice and impose emergency fines for serious violations. According to state records, none of these amendments were properly filed or voted on, as required by Florida law for HOAs. I whistled low. So, he's basically been running a dictatorship, making up rules as he goes? Sarah nodded grimly. And charging everyone for the privilege. The HOA fees here are almost double the average for similar communities in this county. I checked the financial statements. There's over $200,000 in the treasury, but the spending records are suspiciously vague. Our investigation took an unexpected turn when Sarah received an email from Emily Chun, an attorney living just 3 streets over. I heard you're having trouble with Wellington, Emily wrote. I've been documenting his HOA violations for 2 years. Want to compare notes? In her home office, Emily showed us a file cabinet dedicated to Richard's reign of terror. He targeted at least 17 homeowners in 3 years, she explained, pointing to a neighborhood map dotted with red pins. His focus was always on new residents and anyone questioning his authority. No one had collectively stood up to him. Sarah asked if anyone had tried. Emily nodded. Frank Thompson, a retired judge, organized an election to remove Richard just last night. The very next morning, Frank's tires were slashed and leave was spray-painted on his garage. Richard investigated and blamed vandals, but the timing was suspicious. The election had record low turnout, and Richard won again. I noticed surveillance cameras installed in Emily's home. I installed those after my mailbox was destroyed when I represented someone fighting Richard's fines, she explained, handing Sarah a flash drive with financial records and improperly modified HOA documents. I haven't had enough for legal action yet, but with more witnesses. Over the next week, Richard escalated his campaign against us. We received violation notices for everything, from grass exceeding height limits by ½ an inch to garbage bins improperly placed 3 inches too far from the curb. Each notice came with a fine, and Richard delivered every single one personally, always with his hand resting on his holstered gun. Sarah documented every interaction and set up subtle security cameras to capture his increasingly aggressive behavior. One evening, Sarah noticed something reflecting sunlight from the large oak tree across the street. Using her tactical binoculars, she confirmed what we both suspected. Richard had installed a surveillance camera aimed directly at our property. That's definitely illegal, she murmured, snapping photos for evidence. No HOA has the authority to surveil individual homes without consent, especially not here in Florida, with its privacy laws. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Emily, attaching the photos. 10 minutes later, Emily replied, "This is exactly what we need. Clear violation of state privacy laws. Let me start drafting a cease and desist." Looking at the cameras pointed at our house from across the street, Sarah just smiled. He wants to play surveillance games? Fine. Let's see who's better at it. She picked up the phone and called someone. Hi, Emily. I think we need to talk about privacy laws and illegal surveillance in Florida. Yes, we've got clear evidence now. At that moment, I realized my wife wasn't just defending herself. She was preparing a comprehensive counteroffensive. 3 days after discovering Richard's illegal surveillance, Sarah implemented the next phase of what she now openly called Operation HOA Takedown. She took a rare day off from base to ensure everything went perfectly. That morning, she deliberately mowed our lawn in a diagonal pattern, a direct violation of Section 5, Paragraph 3 of Richard's Precious Covenant, which specified that all lawns must be mowed in straight, parallel lines perpendicular to the street. It was exactly the kind of arbitrary, unenforceable rule that Richard lived to enforce. Then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. At precisely 10:17 a.m., Richard's black SUV with a custom Hope license plate pulled up in front of our house. This time, he wasn't alone. Karen Peterson clutched. Her ever-present clipboard clutched tightly. Karen Peterson stood beside a stocky man I didn't recognize, who hovered slightly behind them with his arms crossed, trying to look intimidating. Sarah met them at the sidewalk, dressed in her full Army combat uniform. She'd just returned from a training exercise with her unit and hadn't changed. At least, that's what Richard would assume. In reality, she had deliberately timed her appearance to coincide with his inevitable inspection. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," she said pleasantly. Richard's face was already flushed with righteous indignation as he thrust a violation notice toward her. "This lawn is in direct violation of community standards," he barked. "Diagonal mowing is expressly forbidden. That's a $1,000 fine, and you'll need to remow immediately in the correct pattern." Sarah made a show of examining the notice before responding. "Interesting. And you're sure this regulation is legally enforceable under Florida state law? Because my understanding is that aesthetic preferences for lawn mowing patterns wouldn't hold up in court as a binding covenant restriction." Richard's flush deepened. "I don't need a court. The HOA agreement you signed gives me full authority to enforce community standards as I see fit." His voice rose, agitated, exactly as Sarah had predicted. She maintained her calm, professional demeanor. "Mr. Wellington, I have been reviewing Florida Statute 720, which governs homeowners associations. It's quite specific about what can and cannot be enforced, as well as proper procedures for notices, hearings, and the homeowner's right to dispute. I'd be happy to discuss these regulations further if you'd like to come inside." The mention of actual laws seemed to further inflame Richard. "Don't you try to lecture me about laws. I was enforcing laws while you were still in diapers," he shouted, his face now approaching purple. "That's when circumstances took an unexpected turn in our favor. A government-issued black Suburban pulled into our driveway, and a tall man in a military uniform similar to Sarah's stepped out. "Lieutenant Johnson, sorry I'm early," he called out. "Colonel Matthews moved up the briefing, so I thought I'd swing by now instead of after lunch." Sarah turned and smiled at the newcomer. "Perfect timing, Captain Rodriguez. I was just discussing some local regulations with our HOA president." She gestured toward Richard, whose expression had suddenly shifted from anger to uncertainty. Captain Rodriguez approached our little group, his bearing unmistakably military. He nodded professionally to Richard and his companions. "Sir, hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Richard seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his eyes darting between Sarah and Captain Rodriguez as the realization slowly dawned that Sarah's uniform wasn't some kind of military cosplay, as he'd previously suggested. "You're actually in the military?" he finally managed. Sarah nodded, expression neutral. "Yes, sir. 10 years of active duty, currently assigned to MacDill. As I was saying about those Florida HOA statutes." Richard cut her off, visibly recalibrating his approach. "Well, I respect our armed forces, of course. But regulations are regulations, Lieutenant. Military or not, everyone in Paradise Pines follows the same rules." He regained some of his previous bluster, his hand moving to rest on his holstered gun, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Captain Rodriguez, whose relaxed posture subtly shifted to alert. "Is there a problem here, Lieutenant Johnson?" he asked, his tone still professional but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Sarah maintained her composure. "Mr. Wellington was just expressing his concerns about our lawn mowing pattern and reminding me of his authority by gesturing to his firearm." The way she phrased it hung in the air, making Richard's hand-on-gun posture suddenly seem inappropriate and threatening in the presence of actual military personnel. He quickly moved his hand away from the weapon. That's not what I was doing," he stammered. Captain Rodriguez's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, Were you just threatening a United States Army officer with a firearm over lawn mowing patterns? The question was delivered calmly, but with the kind of authority that made Richard take an involuntary step backward.
No, of course not.
It's just a habit from my law enforcement days, Sarah smiled slightly. Richard is a former traffic enforcement officer who now heads our HOA. He's very dedicated to his role, she added, emphasizing traffic enforcement in a way that made Richard wince. At this point, Karen Peterson tugged urgently at Richard's sleeve. Richard, we should probably continue this discussion another time, she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Richard nodded stiffly, clearly eager for an exit strategy. Yes, well, I'll take the violation notice with you, Lieutenant. We can discuss payment terms later. Richard turned to leave, then paused. And I expect that lawn remowed properly by the end of the day. As they retreated toward Richard's SUV, Captain Rodriguez turned to Sarah with raised eyebrows. That's the HOA terrorist you told us about? The one who's been harassing half the neighborhood. Sarah nodded, watching Richard drive away.
Yep.
Former meter maid who now gets his kicks threatening people with a gun over paint colors and grass patterns. Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief. And he just tried to pull that tough guy act with a Delta operator? Man has a death wish. He glanced at me and added, No offense, sir, but your wife is one of the best close-quarters combat specialists I've ever worked with. That guy has no idea who he just tried to intimidate. The encounter with Captain Rodriguez had clearly shaken Richard, but Sarah knew it wouldn't be enough to stop him. If anything, being embarrassed in front of his HOA minions would only make him more determined to reassert his authority. He'll be back, she predicted as we watched his SUV disappear around the corner. And next time, he'll come prepared. As Sarah predicted, Richard's humiliation only fueled his determination to put us in our place. The next day, we received 5 separate violation notices, each more ridiculous than the last. Apparently, our garden hose was improperly coiled, a $500 fine. Our mailbox was 0.75 inches below regulation height, $7.50 fine. And the American flag we'd hung on our porch was displayed at an incorrect angle, a $1,000 fine. The total came to over $4,000 in fines, with a note that failure to pay within 48 hours would result in liens being placed against our property. But something unexpected happened that evening. Our doorbell rang around 7 p.m., and I opened it to find a middle-aged woman standing on our porch, glancing nervously over her shoulder. I'm Linda Wellington, she said in a hushed voice. Richard's wife. May I come in for a moment? I don't want anyone to see me here. We invited her in, and Sarah offered her tea as she perched anxiously on the edge of our sofa. I'm sorry about Richard, she began, hands fidgeting with her teacup. He wasn't always like this. When we first moved here, he was just enthusiastic about the neighborhood. But over the years, it's become an obsession. She explained that Richard had been deeply affected by his dismissal from the security guard position. He felt humiliated, powerless. The HOA presidency gave him back that sense of control he lost. But lately he's been getting worse, more paranoid, more aggressive. Linda lowered her voice even further. After what happened yesterday with a military officer, he was up all night researching both of you online. He's convinced you're part of some conspiracy to undermine him. He's called emergency meetings with his inner circle on the HOA board. They're plotting something, but they won't tell me what. As Linda was leaving, she pressed a USB drive into Sarah's hand. These are copies of the real HOA financial records, not the ones he shows at meetings, and recordings of some of his planning sessions. I'm afraid he's going to do something extreme, and I can't stand by anymore. She looked at us pleadingly. Just please don't tell him it came from me.
He's not a violent man. Not really.
But when he feels cornered, she didn't need to finish the sentence. After Linda left, Sarah immediately plugged the USB drive into her laptop. What we found was shocking, even after everything we'd already discovered. The financial records showed that Richard had been skimming money from the HOA funds for years. Small amounts from each homeowner's dues, adding up to thousands of dollars annually. He'd created fake landscaping and maintenance companies that billed the HOA for services never performed, with payments going to accounts he controlled. The audio recordings were even more damning. In meetings with his inner circle, which included Karen Peterson and 3 other board members, Richard openly discussed how to make examples of homeowners who challenged him. In one particularly disturbing recording from just that morning, Richard could be heard saying, "These military types think they're above the rules. We need to show everyone what happens when people defy the HOA. I'm thinking we go beyond fines. Maybe an accident happens to their property. Nothing traceable, of course." A woman's voice, presumably Karen's, suggested targeting my car's brake lines, making it sound like concern. But Richard's response sent chills down my spine. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. Besides, it would just be a small leak. Educational, not fatal. Sarah's expression remained neutral as we listened, but I knew that cold look in her eyes. Richard had just crossed a line, from annoying HOA dictator to genuine threat. "Time to accelerate the timeline," she said, pulling out her phone to call Emily. "We're no longer just dealing with harassment," Sarah said quietly. "He's plotting actual property damage. Damage, possibly endangering lives." Within hours, Sarah had assembled what she jokingly called her civilian task force in our living room. Emily Chun, the attorney, James Wilson, our neighbor who'd been documenting Richard's behavior, Frank Thompson, the retired judge, and 3 other homeowners who'd been particularly targeted by Richard's regime. "Based on what we've just learned, we need to move quickly," Sarah explained, laying out printed copies of the financial records and transcripts of the recordings. "Richard is escalating, and he's desperate. That makes him dangerous." Frank Thompson, a distinguished man in his 70s with a shock of white hair, studied the financial documents with a practiced eye. "This is textbook embezzlement. With these records, we could have him arrested tomorrow." Emily shook her head. "But we need more than just the recordings and files. Linda could claim they were fabricated, and it would be her word against ours. We need to catch him in the act doing something that can't be explained away." That's when Sarah outlined her plan, what she called Operation Freedom Pines. It was a comprehensive strategy that utilized everyone's skills and resources. James would expand his surveillance network to document Richard's movements around the neighborhood. Emily would prepare legal documents for an emergency injunction based on the evidence we already had. Frank would use his judicial connections to ensure our complaints were taken seriously by local authorities. And Sarah? Sarah would set the perfect trap. "Richard's weakness is his ego and his need for control," she explained. "We're going to create a situation where he'll be so desperate to reassert his authority that he'll overstep in ways that can't be ignored legally or morally." The plan required perfect timing and coordination, but as Sarah reminded everyone, this is basically a condensed version of operations I've run in much more hostile environments. Trust me, Richard Wellington has no idea who he's messing with. As our new allies departed with their assignments, I asked Sarah if she was sure this was the right approach. "We could just pay the fines, repaint the door, and keep our heads down until my contract is up next year," I suggested. Sarah looked at me with a mix of determination and principle that reminded me why I fell in love with her in the first place. "Mike, this isn't just about us anymore. Richard's targeting vulnerable people in this community, retirees on fixed incomes, single parents, people without the resources or knowledge to fight back. Someone needs to stand up to bullies like him. And standing up to bullies happens to be in my job description." She glanced at the neighborhood map Emily had marked with all of Richard's victims. "Besides, from a tactical perspective, we've now got something Richard doesn't have. A united community. And that's how you win any conflict, whether it's overseas or right here in suburbia." Sarah implemented her plan. The next morning, while Richard was at his weekly HOA meeting at Paradise Pines Cafe, Sarah and I created a massive American flag design across our front lawn using washable paint. This deliberately violated Section 7, Paragraph 18. Lawns must be uniform in color, no patterns or designs permitted. Word spread quickly, and neighbors started stopping by to see our display and share their own Wellington horror stories. Around 1 p.m., James texted, "Eagle is leaving the nest, ETA, 5 men." Richard was on his way. Sarah positioned everyone strategically. Emily and Frank observed from a parked car across the street. James activated cameras on several neighbors' properties. I stood on the porch, recording with my phone. Sarah took her place in the center of our lawn, flag in full army uniform standing at parade rest. Her commanding officer had approved her wearing the uniform and arranged for Captain Rodriguez and 2 unit members to happen by if needed. Richard screeched to a halt in front of our house at 10:08 p.m., exploding from his SUV with Karen Peterson and his brother-in-law trailing behind him. "What the hell is this, Richard?" he bellowed, hand already resting on his gun. Sarah remained composed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wellington. I see you've noticed our patriotic display for Veterans Day." Richard was furious. "This violates the covenant." Sarah calmly corrected him. "This is our private property, and the paint is temporary." Section 12, Paragraph 7 explicitly states that patriotic displays for national holidays are permitted. Veterans Day is within the 10-day window allowed for holiday displays. Backed into a corner by his own rules, Richard made a critical mistake. Sarah entered as he unholstered his gun and held it at his side. "I've had enough of your rule twisting. This ends now. Remove this desecration immediately, or I'll remove you from this neighborhood permanently." In the split second after Richard drew. As Richard drew his weapon, several things happened simultaneously. Jane signaled from across the street, confirming all cameras were recording. Emily began quietly calling the police. And Sarah, she didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't show a hint of fear. Instead, she locked eyes with Richard and spoke in a voice loud enough to be captured by every recording device in the vicinity. "Mr. Wellington, you are now threatening a United States Army officer with a deadly weapon on private property. I'm going to give you one chance to holster that gun and step back, or I will be forced to defend myself." Caught up in his power play, Richard didn't register the arrival of the black Suburban that pulled up behind him. Captain Rodriguez and 2 other uniformed soldiers emerged, taking in the scene with professional alertness. "Lieutenant Johnson," Rodriguez called out, his voice deliberately casual but his posture combat-ready. "Is there a problem here?" Richard spun around, startled by the new voices, his gun still in hand now inadvertently pointed in the general direction of the 3 Army personnel. "Drop the weapon now," Rodriguez's command voice echoed down the street as all 3 soldiers moved into defensive positions. Suddenly realizing the severity of his situation, Richard fumbled to holster his gun, nearly dropping it in the process. I'm authorized to carry this," he stammered. Captain Rodriguez approached carefully, his training evident in every controlled movement. "Sir, having a permit to carry doesn't authorize you to draw and aim at people over lawn decorations." He positioned himself between Richard and Sarah. "Lieutenant Johnson, as your superior officer, I'm ordering you to file a full report on this incident. And, sir," he turned back to Richard, "I strongly suggest you leave these premises immediately before local law enforcement arrives. They tend to take a dim view of civilians threatening military personnel with firearms." Richard's face had gone from crimson to ashen. His hand trembled as he secured his weapon and took several unsteady steps backward. Karen Peterson was already retreating to the SUV, wanting no part of what had just transpired. "This isn't over," Richard hissed, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. As if on cue, police sirens approached. "Actually, Mr. Wellington," Sarah replied calmly, "I think it is." By the time Richard fled, 3 police cruisers were pulling up. The next few hours involved statements, evidence collection, and witness testimonies. The officers were skeptical until they saw video evidence from multiple angles showing Richard drawing his weapon. "We'll need all copies of this footage," the lead officer said. "This is serious. Brandishing a weapon, making threats, potentially a hate crime against military personnel." Emily presented our documented evidence of Richard's harassment pattern, financial improprieties, and recorded conversations discussing property damage. "I believe you'll find this relevant to your investigation." By nightfall, the story had spread throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors stopped by to share support and their own Wellington horror stories. Frank Thompson arrived with champagne. "They're executing a search warrant on Richard's house and the HOA office right now." They found some very interesting financial records. James raised his glass to Operation Freedom Pines and to the best tactician our neighborhood has ever seen. Sarah accepted the praise modestly. Just doing what needed to be done. No different than any other mission. Identify the threat, gather intelligence, develop a strategy, and execute with precision. The next morning, Richard was released on bail, his local government connections proving real. Though police confiscated his weapon and issued a restraining order, he wasn't neutralized. "We've won the battle, but not the war," Sarah noted. Soon, strange things began happening. James's tires were slashed. Emily's client appointments were mysteriously canceled. Someone attempted to access Sarah's military personnel file using stolen credentials. "He's using his network," Sarah concluded during an emergency meeting. "Richard has people with access and resources working for him." The breakthrough came when Linda Wellington appeared at our door, looking terrified. "Richard's been making calls nonstop," she whispered. "He has friends at the sheriff's department and mayor's office, and he's been talking daily with Senator Williams. They're planning to discredit you all before the court case." This explained everything. Senator Williams was notorious for corruption and taking bribes from developers. Sarah immediately recognized the implications. "This isn't about lawn ornaments," she said after Linda left. "Follow the money, Paradise. Paradise Pines has value we're not seeing." Emily and Frank discovered that Paradise Pines sat on land being considered for highway expansion and had valuable mineral rights due to natural gas discoveries nearby. The HOA controls collective negotiating rights for any community-wide land deals. Emily explained, "Whoever controls the HOA controls whether this land gets sold and for how much." Frank added, "And Senator Williams approves highway funding through the Transportation Committee. If Richard is working for him, they could be orchestrating a land grab worth millions." Soon, unknown cars began parking near our house. Our mail arrived opened. Someone even tried using a forged ID to enter MacDill Air Force Base, asking about Sarah's unit. "We're being watched," Sarah acknowledged. "But two can play that game." She called some former colleagues, and the next day, 3 nondescript individuals arrived carrying duffel bags, moving with the same alertness as Sarah. Within hours, they established a counter-surveillance operation with hidden cameras and signal interceptors and began tracing connections between Richard, Senator Williams, and their network of officials. "This is now a counterintelligence operation," Sarah explained. Richard thought this was a simple HOA dispute. He had no idea he was fighting someone trained to dismantle enemy networks. Meanwhile, I contributed the best way I knew how as a software engineer. I developed systems for tracking complex data relationships, and now I applied those skills to mapping Richard's network. Every connection, every financial transaction, every communication we could document went into my database. Patterns emerged. Shell companies connected to Senator Williams, but managed by Richard's brother-in-law, property transactions throughout the county that followed a similar pattern to what was happening in Paradise Pines, mysterious withdrawals from the HOA fund that coincided with key votes on the Transportation Committee. "This isn't just corruption," Emily concluded as we reviewed my findings. "This is organized crime with a suburban facade." The breakthrough came when one of Sarah's friends successfully cloned the phone of Detective Morris, Richard's contact at the sheriff's department. The text messages revealed an explicit conspiracy. "Need dirt on the military woman," son says. "Fine anything, drugs, affairs, mental health issues. Needs her discredited before the hearing." Another message outlined plans to plant evidence in our home during a fraudulent wellness check scheduled for the following day. "That's it," Sarah decided. "We're not waiting for them to move against us. Time to spring the trap." She gathered our coalition and outlined the final phase of Operation Freedom Pines.
Everyone had a role to play.
As Sarah reminded us in special operations, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. We're going to move deliberately and catch them in the act. The morning of the planned wellness check arrived, and our house was prepared. Sarah's team had installed hidden cameras throughout the property capturing every angle. Emily had prepared legal documents and contacted trusted law enforcement officials who weren't in Richard's pocket. Frank had reached out to a judge for emergency warrants once evidence was collected. I had set up a secure cloud server where all surveillance footage would be instantly uploaded, ensuring that even if our equipment was discovered or destroyed, the evidence would persist. Sarah and I made a show of leaving the house together around 10 a.m., making sure we were spotted by the unmarked car that had been surveilling us. In reality, we drove around the block and re-entered through a neighbor's connecting backyard, where we joined Sarah's team in a hidden observation post set up in our own basement. At precisely 11:17 a.m., Detective Morris arrived with 2 uniformed deputies. They approached our front door and knocked perfunctorily before Morris used a master key, obtained illegally, we later learned, to enter our home. "Police wellness check," he called out, but their subsequent actions revealed their true purpose. The deputies began systematically searching our house while Morris directed them to specific locations. "Check the master bedroom nightstand," he instructed, "and look behind the toilet tank in the main bathroom." They were clearly searching predetermined hiding spots, not conducting a legitimate welfare check. When one deputy headed for the kitchen, Morris redirected him. "No time for that. Focus on finding the evidence in the locations I told you about." We watched as Morris removed a small bag and instructed a deputy to plant it in our bedroom drawer. "Make sure it looks hidden," Morris directed. "Williams wants this to stick. Once we file the drug possession report, her military career is over and their case falls apart." The uncomfortable deputy complied. "This doesn't feel right. These people are military," he murmured. Morris dismissed his concern. "Heroes or troublemakers, doesn't matter. Williams needs this subdivision deal, and Wellington delivers votes, so we deliver for Richard." After they left, Sarah contacted Captain Rodriguez, who arrived with military police to document the planted evidence without disturbing fingerprints. Emily filed emergency motions, and within hours federal agents arrested Detective Morris. The deputies quickly turned on him, agreeing to testify in exchange for leniency. FBI agents then raided Senator Williams's office and Richard's home simultaneously. What they uncovered shocked everyone. Richard was part of a multi-million-dollar land fraud scheme orchestrated by Williams. HOA funds had been drained to finance political campaigns and bribe officials. The arbitrary rules were designed to drive down property values and force out resistant homeowners. They even discovered that Paradise Pines had been built with substandard materials through Williams family companies, with falsified environmental reports hiding health risks. The entire community had been a sophisticated con from the beginning. The next morning, the story broke across local and then national news. State senator and HOA president arrested in massive fraud conspiracy. Satellite trucks lined our quiet suburban streets as reporters sought comments from residents, the most visible victims of Richard's campaign. Sarah and I found ourselves reluctantly thrust into the spotlight. When a reporter asked Sarah how she had managed to expose such a complex criminal enterprise, she simply smiled and said, "I just applied the same principles we use in military intelligence. Identify vulnerabilities, gather evidence, and execute a precise operation. The only difference is that usually I'm doing it in places a lot more dangerous than a Florida subdivision." In the weeks that followed, Paradise Pines underwent a remarkable transformation. With Richard and his inner circle facing multiple federal charges, the community held an emergency election for a new HOA board. Frank Thompson, the retired judge, was unanimously elected president with Emily Chun as legal counsel and James Wilson as treasurer. Their first act was to commission a complete audit of the HOA finances and a thorough review of all the arbitrary rules Richard had implemented over the years. They found over 150 regulations that had never been properly approved by homeowners. Frank announced at the first general meeting, "Everything from the color of your doors to how you fold your garden hose, none of it was legally enforceable. Today, we're wiping the slate clean and starting over with a simple 10-page document that focuses on what really matters, maintaining our community without infringing on individual rights." The revelation about the substandard construction and environmental concerns initially caused panic, but Sarah stepped in with characteristic efficiency. She contacted colleagues at the Army Corps of Engineers who volunteered to conduct comprehensive structural and environmental assessments of every home in Paradise Pines. When serious issues were discovered in about 30% of the properties, Emily led a class action lawsuit against Williams Development Companies. The settlement not only funded all necessary repairs, but also established a trust for long-term infrastructure maintenance. This neighborhood wasn't just ruled by a tyrant, Emily explained at the settlement announcement. It was built on lies. Today we're literally and figuratively rebuilding its foundation. Richard Wellington remained defiant even after his arrest, insisting through his attorney that he was the victim of a military coup in his neighborhood. But as evidence mounted and his co-conspirators turned state's witness one by one, his bravado crumbled. Senator Williams, facing decades in prison for corruption and fraud, quickly implicated Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence. Detective Morris provided detailed accounts of years of evidence tampering and harassment conducted at Richard's behest. Karen Peterson, the ever-present HOA secretary, turned over meticulously detailed records of every illegal action the HOA had taken under Richard's direction. Apparently, she'd been documenting everything as an insurance policy all along. 6 months later, Richard faced 37 charges including embezzlement, fraud, illegal surveillance, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The most serious charge, attempting to frame a military officer with false evidence, carried a potential 20-year sentence. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, Richard finally broke down as he was led away. The judge sentenced him to 18 years, citing his extraordinary breach of community trust and vindictive targeting of military personnel. Richard's assets were seized to fund Paradise Pines' restoration, including a community garden built where his house once stood. A year after our confrontation over the patriotic lawn flag, Paradise Pines celebrated its reconstruction. Homes had been repaired, the community center renovated, and a playground built where Richard's cameras once surveilled residents. Standing on our porch with its still vibrant red door, Sarah watched children playing freely in yards no longer subject to arbitrary rules. In all my operations, I've never seen a more complete victory, she said. Usually we disrupt a target and move on, never knowing if we made a lasting difference. But here, she gestured to neighbors chatting freely across property lines, children playing without fear of HOA citations. Frank Thompson approached our house carrying a slim binder. Hot off the presses, he announced proudly, the new Paradise Pines Community Guidelines, just 10 pages long. He opened to the first page, where a simple mission statement was prominently displayed. Mutual respect is the only rule we truly need. Frank chuckled. We do still have a few necessary regulations about noise levels and safety issues, but nothing about lawn mowing patterns or door colors. A new family was moving in across the street, and Frank excused himself to deliver their copy of the guidelines. I watched as he greeted them warmly, pointing toward our house as he spoke. The young couple looked over, noticed our red door, and waved. Sarah waved back. I bet Frank is telling them the story, she said with a smile, about how an HOA president pulled a gun on his neighbor, not knowing she was Delta Force and still active. I slipped my arm around her waist. You know, most people's HOA disputes end with strongly worded letters or maybe a small claims court appearance. Leave it to you to turn it into a federal case that takes down a corrupt state senator. Sarah laughed, leaning into me. What can I say? Go big or go home. Or in this case, go big to protect our home. As we watched the sun setting over our transformed community, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her commanding officer. She read it and smiled. Remember how I told you that sometimes we never know if our operations make a lasting difference? Well, apparently the FBI is using our Paradise Pines case as a training model for investigating public corruption. They're calling it Operation Red Door. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. What began as a petty dispute over door paint had exposed layers of corruption that might have otherwise remained hidden for years, affecting countless lives. All because a power-hungry HOA president made the critical mistake of pulling a gun on the wrong woman. An elite Delta Force operator who knew exactly how to dismantle threats, whether they came from foreign terrorists or suburban tyrants with delusions of grandeur. And if you're ever driving through Florida and come across a peaceful subdivision with a striking red door on one particular house, just remember, sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one with the gun, but the one who knows exactly what to do when someone points it at.